The hall was cold and enormous, built from a dark metal that absorbed light and sound equally. And in this place, the fates of entire worlds had been decided for nearly 1,000,000 years. They called it the Hall of Extinction. It sat at the center of a station so large that it had its own gravity, a structure floating at the heart of the Orion Arm, where over 4,000 spacefaring civilizations sent their representatives to govern the known galaxy. The Galactic Conclave was not a place of kindness. It was a place of order, and on this day it had gathered for a purpose that most of its members considered routine. Arbiter Yalon Drew stood at the center of the hall, his crystalline body catching the faint blue light that pulsed from the walls around him. He was tall, even by the standards of his own species, the Selvari, a race of beings whose bodies were made of a living mineral that hummed faintly when they spoke. He had served the Conclave for 300 years, and in that time he had overseen the review of dozens of species that had been flagged for what the Conclave called pre-ascension risk assessment. Not all of those reviews ended in death, but most of them did. Today the subject was a small blue world orbiting a very ordinary star at the edge of the galaxy, a planet its inhabitants called Earth, and the species that lived on it had been designated in the Conclave's records as Species 7921C, humanity. Yalon raised one long arm, and the hall went silent. 4,000 delegations, each one representing billions or trillions of lives, turned their attention to the massive holographic display that flickered to life above the chamber floor. "We begin the final review," Yalon said, his voice resonating through the translation systems that converted his harmonic speech into thousands of alien languages simultaneously. The first images appeared, and they were not gentle. Fire swept across ancient cities as armies clashed with swords and spears. The hologram shifted forward through time, and the weapons grew worse. Guns and cannons and bombs that could flatten entire neighborhoods in a single blast. Then came the image that always silenced the hall when a species like this was reviewed. A mushroom cloud rising over a city, and then another one 3 days later. And the Conclave learned that humanity had built a weapon capable of ending all life on their world, and then had used it on their own kind. A murmur rippled through the delegations, not of shock, because many of them had seen this pattern before, but of confirmation. The hologram continued. Wars fought over land, over resources, over ideas, over the color of skin and the names of gods. Forests burned to make room for machines, oceans choked with poison, ice caps melting, while the species argued about whether it was even happening. Yalon watched the faces of the delegations, or what passed for faces among species that ranged from insectoid hive minds to beings made of pure energy, and he saw what he always saw during these reviews. Fear. Not fear of what humanity had done to itself, but fear of what it might do to others if it ever left its little world and found its way to the stars. A delegate from the Mokhtari, a species of massive reptilian warriors who had conquered half a spiral arm before the Conclave forced them into a peace treaty, stood and spoke in a voice like grinding stone. "They split the atom before they learned to feed their own young," the Mokhtari said. "They are a danger not only to themselves, but to every world within reach of their ships, and their ships grow faster with every generation." A delegate from the Ulhari, a hive-mind species that moved and fought as one, added its voice, a clicking, buzzing chorus that the translators rendered as a single flat statement. "The probability models are clear. If species 7921C achieves faster than light travel within the next 500 standard cycles, the likelihood of aggressive expansion is above 90%. We recommend immediate cleansing." Yalon listened as delegation after delegation rose to speak, and nearly every one of them said the same thing in different words. This species was too violent, too unstable, too dangerous to be allowed to continue. He had heard these arguments before, many times, and they were not wrong. The Conclave had records of species like humanity, species that had burned through their home worlds and then reached out to burn through others, and the cost of inaction had sometimes been billions of lives lost across dozens of star systems. The Conclave had learned its lesson long ago. It was better to act early, before the fire could spread. When the last delegation had spoken, Yelan called the vote. The results appeared on the display almost instantly. 4,298 civilizations voted in favor of dispatching a cleansing fleet to the Sol system. 14 abstained. None voted against. The decision was made, and it was made with the same calm efficiency that the Conclave applied to everything. There was no hatred in it, no anger, just a calculation. A cold, mathematical certainty that the galaxy would be safer without humanity in it. Within hours, the fleet began to assemble. 12,000 warships drawn from dozens of species, each one carrying enough firepower to crack a continent, and together they formed the largest cleansing fleet the Conclave had authorized in over 10,000 years. The fleet's commander was an officer named Halox Ven, a sharp and disciplined soldier from a militaristic species that had built its entire civilization around the concept of duty. Halox did not enjoy killing, but he did not hesitate at it either, and he considered the mission to be a simple matter of galactic hygiene. The fleet departed from the Conclave station and began its long journey toward a small yellow star that none of them had ever visited, carrying with it enough destruction to turn Earth into a lifeless rock in a matter of hours. And that should have been the end of it. It should have been just another line in the Conclave's long history of difficult but necessary decisions, another species quietly erased before it could become a threat. But something happened that no one expected. In a small research vessel trailing behind the fleet, a young Selvari analyst named Chorus Tall was performing her assigned duty, a final routine scan of Earth's electromagnetic emissions, the last piece of bureaucratic procedure before an extinction order could be formally executed. Chorus was methodical and quiet, and had never once questioned a Conclave decision in her entire career. She was the kind of person who did her work, filed her reports, and went home. She aimed her sensors at Earth and began recording the electromagnetic noise that poured out of the little planet. Radio waves, television signals, digital transmissions, all of it tangled together in a chaotic mess that her equipment struggled to sort through. Most of it was exactly what she expected. Military communications, political broadcasts, commercial signals selling products to a species that seemed obsessed with buying things it did not need. But then her instruments caught something else, something buried deep in the noise, something her filters had almost discarded as irrelevant. It was faint and strange, and it did not match any of the categories her training had prepared her for. She leaned closer to her console and isolated the frequency, running it through her translation matrix, and what came back made her pause for the first time in her professional life. It was not a weapon. It was not a threat. It was not a military communication or a political broadcast. It was a sound. A single human voice, unaccompanied, singing a melody so simple and so raw that Chorus did not know what to do with it. She flagged it in her system and attached a note recommending further analysis before the fleet reached Sol. She sent the report up the chain of command. No one responded. No one even opened it. Chorus sat alone in her small ship, trailing behind 12,000 warships headed to kill a world, and she listened to the strange sound again, that single, fragile voice singing into the darkness of space. And for a reason she could not explain, she did not delete it from her records. She saved it, and she kept listening. Chorus, Tall, had not slept in 4 days. Her small research vessel drifted silently behind the cleansing fleet, its engines running on minimal power, and inside its narrow cabin, every screen and every speaker was filled with the noise of Earth. She had started with that single voice, that one strange melody she had flagged in her report. But when she dug deeper into the electromagnetic emissions pouring out of the blue planet, she realized that it was not one signal. It was billions. They were layered on top of each other across every frequency humanity had ever used, tangled together like threads in a cloth, so dense that no scanner could separate them without days of careful work. And Chorus had given it exactly that. Days and days of patient, obsessive, sleepless work. What she found changed everything she thought she knew. The first category was something her translation matrix labeled as music. And at first she assumed it was ritual sound, the kind of repetitive chanting that many primitive species used during worship or before battle. But it was not that. It was something she had never encountered in any conclave database covering 900,000 years of galactic civilization. It was pure emotional expression, sound created not to serve a function, but to make the listener feel something. There were millions of these compositions, and they covered emotions that Chorus did not even have words for in her own language. There were sounds that her matrix said represented grief, and others that meant joy, and others that seemed to hold both at the same time, in a way that made her crystalline body hum at frequencies she had never experienced before. She found a piece created by a human named Beethoven, and her instruments told her that this human had been unable to hear sound at all when he wrote it, and she had to run that data 3 times because she was certain there was an error. But there was no error. A deaf human had composed something that made entire rooms full of hearing humans weep. She did not understand. She could not understand, but she kept listening. The second category was even stranger, and it took her the longest time to believe what her translation matrix was telling her. Fiction. Humans invented stories about things that had never happened. They created entire worlds that did not exist, and filled them with people who had never been born. And they did this not to deceive, but to explore what it meant to be alive. In these stories, humans imagined themselves as better than they were. They wrote tales of sacrifice, of courage, of ordinary people standing up against impossible darkness. And the strangest part was that they also wrote stories where the hero failed, where the good did not win, where everything fell apart. And they told those stories too, because losing was also part of being human, and they refused to look away from it. No species in the Conclave's records had ever done this. Other civilizations had histories and records, but none of them had invented an entire art form built around imagining lives they had never lived. The third thing Chorus found made her stop working and sit in silence for a very long time. Memorials. Humanity had built enormous structures and institutions dedicated not to celebrating their victories, but to remembering their own crimes. They had museums filled with evidence of their worst atrocities, places where they brought their own children to show them what their species had done wrong, so that the children might choose differently. They had a word for it that her translator struggled with. Never again. A phrase that admitted guilt and expressed hope in the same breath. No species in the Conclave's records had ever built monuments to its own shame. Most species buried their failures or rewrote their histories to hide them. But humans carved their sins into stone and placed them in the centers of their cities where everyone could see. And then there was the last thing, the thing that confused her more than anything else. Laughter. A sound produced by the human body in response to things that were funny, or absurd, or painful, or joyful, or all of those at once. A sound that her translator could identify, but could not fully decode, because it seemed to serve too many purposes at the same time. Humans laughed at danger. They laughed at death. They laughed at themselves and at each other, and at the pure ridiculousness of being alive on a tiny rock spinning through an empty universe. And this laughter was not cruelty. It was something else entirely, something like defiance, something like love. Chorus compiled everything she had found into a formal report. She organized it carefully. She documented every source. She cross-referenced it against every known species in the Conclave's records, to prove that what humanity produced was unique in the history of the galaxy. And she transmitted the entire package to Arbiter Yalen Drew with a single urgent request. Delay the fleet. Something is wrong with the verdict. We did not look closely enough. Yalen received the report and read it, and Chorus could tell from his brief response that he was troubled by what she had shown him. But his answer was what she had feared. "It is noise decorated with sentiment," he wrote back. "The vote was lawful, and the fleet will continue. Your duty is to observe, not to advocate." Chorus read his response and felt something she had never felt before, a kind of burning frustration that her species was not supposed to be capable of, because the Salvari were creatures of logic and calm, and yet here she was, trembling at her console, wanting to scream. She made a decision. It was illegal. It violated at least 11 Conclave regulations, and would certainly end her career and possibly her freedom. But she made it anyway. She took the raw, unfiltered package of Earth signals, the music, the stories, the laughter, the memorials, all of it, and she broadcast it on an open channel to every single ship in the cleansing fleet. 12,000 warships received it simultaneously. Chorus did not add commentary. She did not explain what it was or why she had sent it. She simply opened the channel and let Earth speak for itself. For several minutes, nothing happened, and Chorus sat in her chair with her hands shaking, waiting for the fleet commander to hail her and place her under arrest. But the arrest did not come. Instead, something else began happening across the fleet. Something quiet and strange and impossible to measure. On the Drenith ships, vessels crewed by a species that communicated entirely through harmonic resonance, the crew members went still as the human music washed over them. For the Drenith, music was not entertainment. It was language, it was thought, it was identity, and what they heard from Earth was a language more complex and more emotionally dense than anything they had encountered in their entire history as a species. They called it the noise that weeps, and several Drenith crew members had to be helped to their resting chambers because the sound overwhelmed their sensory systems. On the Yulhari ships, the insectoid hive mind encountered human fiction for the first time, and experienced something that could only be described as a malfunction. The concept of imagining a life you had never lived, of creating a person who did not exist and caring about what happened to them, was so alien to the Ulhari way of thinking that their collective consciousness stuttered, and for the first time in recorded history, individual Ulhari began asking questions that the Hive had no answer for. On the Mokthari warships, the massive reptilian warriors listened to recordings of human wars and were not impressed. They had seen worse. But then they heard something that stopped them cold. Recordings of peace treaties, of enemies shaking hands, of soldiers from opposite sides meeting years later and weeping together. And the Mokthari did not know what to do with this information, because in their entire history, no war had ever ended with both sides still standing. Fleet Commander Halux Ven noticed the unauthorized transmission immediately and traced it back to Chorus's vessel. He ordered her channel shut down and marked her for arrest upon arrival at Sol. But the damage, or the miracle, depending on who was asked, was already done. The signal was inside the fleet now, spreading from ship to ship, crew to crew, species to species, and it could not be unheard. And in the final minutes of the broadcast, the 4 Halox's technicians cut the feed. One last piece of audio played across every speaker on every ship in the fleet. It was the voice of a human woman, and she was singing softly, gently, the way someone sings when the room is dark and the world is quiet, and the only thing that matters is the small life in their arms. It was a lullaby. Several species in the fleet had no equivalent concept. They had never heard an adult sing a child to sleep. They did not know what it meant to make soft sounds in the dark, to keep something small and helpless from being afraid. But they heard it now. And the fleet did not stop. Its engines still burned toward Earth. Its weapons still hummed with power. Its mission had not changed. But something inside it had shifted, quietly and invisibly, like a crack forming in a wall that everyone believed was solid. And Chorus Tall sat alone in her little ship, under arrest, waiting to face punishment for the worst crime of her career. She was not sorry. She was not sorry at all. The cleansing fleet was breaking apart from the inside, and Fleet Commander Halox Ven could feel it. Not in any way his instruments could measure. The ships were still in formation, the engines still burned towards Sol, the weapons system still reported ready. But Halox had commanded warships for long enough to know when discipline was cracking, and it was cracking now. It had started with the Drenith. 3 days after the unauthorized broadcast, the Drenith contingent, 47 ships that communicated through harmonic vibration, formally requested a delay in the mission timeline. Their stated reason was that they needed additional time to process acoustic data of strategic importance. But Halox knew what that meant. They were still listening to the music. He denied the request and ordered them to maintain speed. But the Drenith ships began falling behind anyway, not enough to break formation, just enough to make a point. They were slowing down, and their harmonics had changed, carrying a low, resonant tone that the fleet's translators could not fully interpret, but that every species with ears could feel in their bones. Then came the Ulhari. The great insectoid hive mind had been acting strangely ever since it encountered human fiction, and now its behavior had become genuinely alarming. Individual Ulhari on several ships had begun doing something that their species had never done in its entire existence. They were telling each other stories. Not reports, not data summaries, not strategic assessments. One Ulhari worker on the command vessel had described to its hive mates an imaginary scenario in which a single Ulhari was separated from the hive and had to survive alone. And the other Ulhari had listened with a kind of horrified fascination, as if they were seeing something forbidden and could not look away. The hive mind's central consciousness sent a formal complaint to Halox, stating that the human broadcast had introduced a cognitive contaminant into their collective thinking, and they demanded that all human signal data be purged from the fleet systems immediately. Halox ordered the purge, but it did not matter. The stories were already inside the Ulhari, passed from mind to mind faster than any technician could delete files. And then there were the Mokhthari. The great reptilian warriors had always been the most reliable contingent in any cleansing fleet. Brutal, efficient, and completely unbothered by the moral weight of extinction. They had burned worlds before and slept well after. But something in the human signal had gotten under their thick-scaled skin, and it was not the violence. The Mokhthari respected violence, understood it, even admired the savage creativity with which humans waged war. What disturbed them was what came after the violence. They had found recordings of something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission from a place called South Africa, where humans who had committed terrible acts of cruelty sat in a room with the people they had hurt and spoke about what they had done, not to be punished, not to be forgiven, but simply to say it out loud so that everyone could hear, and so that the truth could exist in the open air. The Mokhthari had no concept for this. In their civilization, the loser of a war was destroyed completely. Its cities, its history, its genetic material, all of it wiped clean so that the victor could begin fresh. The idea that two enemies could sit in the same room and choose to build something new together was so foreign to the Mokhthari that their senior commander requested a private meeting with Halox to ask a single question. "How do they stop?" the Mokhthari asked. They fight like beasts, worse than beasts, and then they stop. How? Halox did not have an answer, and that made him angry, because Halox always had answers. That was his purpose, his function, the reason he had been chosen to lead this fleet. He was a being of certainty in a universe that rewarded certainty, and now that certainty was being eaten away by the sound of a species singing to its children in the dark. He made a decision. He would accelerate the timeline. The fleet had been scheduled to arrive at Sol in 11 galactic cycles, roughly 2 Earth years. But Halox pushed the engines harder and cut the approach to months. The faster they arrived, the less time this strange infection would have to spread. Meanwhile, far behind the fleet, at the Conclave station, Arbiter Yalon Drew was doing something he had not done in over a century. He was doubting himself. Chorus Tal's report sat in his personal files, officially dismissed, officially irrelevant, and yet he found himself returning to it again and again in the quiet hours when the Conclave's halls were empty and no one could see him. He told himself he was simply being thorough. He told himself it was professional curiosity and nothing more. He told himself that a species capable of building nuclear weapons and using them on its own cities was exactly the kind of threat the cleansing protocol had been designed to eliminate. And then he found the Voyager Golden Record. It was buried in the data Chorus had sent him. A small artifact that humanity had launched into space decades ago, attached to a probe that was never meant to reach anyone. A message in a bottle, thrown into an ocean so vast that the odds of anyone finding it were essentially zero. And yet, they had made it anyway. It contained sounds, greetings in 55 human languages, music from every corner of their small world, the sound of wind and rain, and a human heartbeat, and images, a woman nursing a child, a man eating a meal, children playing, the structure of their DNA, a map showing where their planet was. It was an introduction. It was a species saying hello to the darkness. Not because anyone was listening, but because they wanted to believe that someone might be. There was no weapon in it. There was no threat. There was no demand or warning or declaration of power. Just, here we are. This is what we sound like. This is what we love. We hope you are out there. Yalon held the data in his crystalline hands and felt something move inside him that he did not recognize. And when he ran a self-diagnostic on his emotional state, the results came back with a term he had not experienced in 300 years of service. Grief. Grief. He was grieving for a species he had voted to destroy. He sat with that feeling for a long time, alone in his chamber. And then he did something that broke every political alliance he had built over 3 centuries of careful, neutral, dispassionate service. He filed a formal request for an emergency stay of extinction. The request triggered an immediate emergency session of the full conclave. Delegations that had already returned to their home systems were summoned back, and the Hall of Extinction filled once again with the representatives of 4,000 civilizations. Yalon stood at the center and presented his case. He showed them the golden record. He played the music. He read translations of human poetry and fiction. He showed them the memorials and the museums and the truth commissions. He showed them a species that was deeply, profoundly broken, and that knew it was broken, and was trying, desperately and imperfectly, to fix itself. We judge them by their worst, Yalon said to the assembly. I am asking us to also consider their best. The debate that followed was the most heated the conclave had seen in 1,000 years. Delegations screamed at each other in frequencies that shattered translation equipment. 2 species nearly came to blows. The Mokhtari representative stood in silence for so long that everyone thought his translator had failed. But when he finally spoke, he said only 6 words. I do not know my answer. The vote was called. The stay of extinction was denied, but the margin had collapsed. Where before, only 14 civilizations had abstained, now 1,200 voted to delay the fleet. It was not enough. and the fleet continued on its course. But something had changed in the conclave, something that could not be undone, a crack in the certainty that had held the institution together for nearly 1,000,000 years. And on Earth, completely unaware that any of this was happening, a young astrophysicist named Amara Osei sat at her desk in Accra and stared at data that made no sense. Her instruments had detected an anomalous energy pattern at the edge of the solar system, a pattern that was too regular to be natural, too structured to be random, too large to be anything she had a name for. She published a quiet paper suggesting that the pattern might be artificial in origin. Almost no one read it. Almost no one believed it. But she kept watching the sky, because Amara Osei had spent her entire life studying the universe, and she knew. She knew with the kind of certainty that lives in the gut, not the mind, that something was coming. She just did not know what. The fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel just beyond Jupiter, and 12,000 warships hung in the black silence of the solar system, like a wall of metal and fire, stretching wider than the planet itself. On Earth, every telescope, every satellite, every radar system, and every amateur astronomer with a backyard dish saw it happen at the same time. The sky was no longer empty. Within minutes, the world's governments were in emergency session. Generals shouted at scientists. Presidents called each other on encrypted lines. Military forces across every continent went to their highest alert status, and none of it mattered. Humanity's most powerful weapons, the nuclear missiles that had once terrified the conclave into voting for extinction, were toys compared to what was floating beyond Jupiter. A single escort frigate from the cleansing fleet carried more destructive power than every weapon humanity had ever built combined. And there were 12,000 ships out there. By any rational calculation, the human species was already dead. It simply had not happened yet. Panic spread the way it always does, fast and uneven. Some cities emptied as people fled into the countryside with no plan and no destination. Some governments tried to maintain calm and failed. Some people sat in their homes and held their families and waited. But then something happened that stunned every species watching from the fleet. Earth did not go silent. Every predictive model in the conclave's 900,000 years of data said the same thing. When a pre-ascension species is confronted with certain extinction, it either collapses into chaos or goes dark with despair. The broadcasts stop, the lights go out, the species curls inward and dies before it is killed. Humanity did neither. Instead, Earth's broadcasts increased. People called their loved ones, not to scream, not to panic, but to say the things they had been too busy or too scared to say before. I love you traveled across phone lines and radio waves and internet signals in every language on Earth, over and over, billions of times, in a single hour. Artists went to their studios and began creating. Painters painted, writers wrote, musicians played, and they shared everything openly, freely, broadcasting it to anyone who would receive it. A teenager in Seoul sat down at her piano and composed a piece she titled For Whoever is Listening, and uploaded it to the internet. And within hours, it had been heard by more people than any song in human history. A poet in Buenos Aires wrote a final verse in every language she knew and published it online with a single note attached. If you are out there and you can read this, know that we tried our best, and it was not always enough, but we tried. Scientists gathered their life's work, decades of research, centuries of accumulated knowledge, and began transmitting it toward the fleet on every frequency they could reach. They sent the data not as a weapon, not as a bargaining chip, but as a gift. The message that accompanied it was simple. Here, this is what we learned. Someone should have it. And in a small house in rural Japan, an elderly man named Takeshi, who had spent 50 years as a radio operator, sat down at his equipment and began broadcasting a message on a loop, aimed directly at the fleet, translated into every language he could manage. "We do not know why you are here. If we have offended, we are sorry. If you are hungry, we will feed you. If you are afraid of us, we understand. We are often afraid of ourselves." The message repeated again and again and again, a small, stubborn voice aimed at the darkness, offering kindness to the thing that had come to kill him. Fleet Commander Halox Ven stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the data pour in from Earth, with an expression that his crew had never seen before. Confusion. This was not supposed to happen. The species was supposed to panic, or surrender, or attack, or go quiet. It was not supposed to start singing. He pushed the confusion aside and gave the order to charge weapons. 12,000 ships began powering their primary batteries, and the hum of those weapons was so deep and so powerful that even the vacuum of space seemed to vibrate with it. And then the fleet broke apart. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way ice breaks on a river in spring, slowly at first, then all at once. The Drenith contingent was the first to go. Their 47 ships powered down completely, every system shutting off except life support, and they went dark and silent in the void. When Halox demanded an explanation, the Drenith commander responded with a single harmonic tone that the translators rendered as, "We will not silence a voice while it is singing." The great hive mind, which had spent the entire journey wrestling with the alien concept of human fiction, made a declaration that echoed across every Olhari ship simultaneously. Species 7921C is a hive of individuals. This is a paradox. Paradoxes must be studied, not destroyed. We refuse the order. Even elements of Halox's own species hesitated. Junior officers on his own flagship looked at each other with doubt in their eyes, because they too had heard the broadcasts from Earth, and they too had heard the old man in Japan offering food to his executioners. And something about that simple, stupid, irrational act of kindness had landed inside them like a stone in still water. Halox felt his control slipping, and he did what any disciplined commander would do. He doubled down. He ordered the loyal ships to advance, to ignore the defectors, to proceed with the mission. Roughly 6,000 ships obeyed. 6,000 ships could still reduce Earth to ash and glass in a matter of hours. The math had not changed. And that was when Chorus Tal did the bravest and most foolish thing anyone in the galaxy had done in a very long time. She flew her little research vessel, a ship so small that the fleet's targeting systems almost ignored it, directly into the space between the advancing warships and Earth. She stopped her ship there, alone, a tiny point of light hanging between an armada and a world. And she began broadcasting. Not a plea, not a warning, not a weapon. She opened every channel her ship had and began retransmitting everything, every signal Earth had ever produced, the music and the stories and the laughter and the apologies and the lullabies and the science and the poetry and the old man in Japan saying, "If you are hungry, we will feed you." All of it, all at once, at maximum power, on every frequency. Her ship became a mirror, reflecting humanity back at the fleet. And the signal was so powerful and so dense that it overwhelmed targeting systems and jammed communication arrays and filled every speaker on every ship with the sound of a species that refused to die in silence. Chorus's ship was not built for this. Its transmission systems were designed for quiet research scanning, not for blasting signals across the solar system. And the power cells began to overload almost immediately. Warning lights filled her cabin. Her hull temperature climbed, and she could feel the ship shaking apart around her. She did not stop. Back at the Conclave, Arbiter Yalon Drew watched the crisis unfold through a real-time feed, and he saw what was happening. He saw the fleet fracturing. He saw Chorus's ship burning itself alive. He saw Earth broadcasting love songs and science papers and apologies to the ships that had come to kill it. And he made a decision. He stood in the Hall of Extinction and invoked a law so old that most of the current delegations did not even know it existed. The right of voice. It was a statute written into the Conclave's founding charter nearly 1,000,000 years ago, a law that said any species facing extinction had the right to send a representative to speak before the Conclave before the sentence could be carried out. It had not been used in 200,000 years, but it had never been repealed. And Yelan's voice was steady and absolute as he spoke the ancient words into the hall. I invoke the right of voice for species 7921C. The fleet will hold. The species will speak. The hall erupted. Delegations shouted and argued, and several threatened to withdraw from the conclave entirely. But the law was the law, and even the oldest and most powerful civilizations in the galaxy had agreed to follow it. A message was sent to the fleet. Hold position. Do not fire. The species has been granted the right of voice. Halox received the order, and his hands tightened on his console until the metal bent. But he was a creature of duty above all else, and he obeyed. The fleet stopped. 6,000 weapons powered down. And in the space between the Armada and the little blue world, Chorus-Tal's ship drifted, smoking and half dead. Its transmission arrays melted, and its hull cracked. And inside it, Chorus sat with burns on her crystalline skin, and a feeling in her chest that she would later learn was called pride. Humanity had been given a chance to speak. Now someone had to find a human brave enough to do it. They had hours, not days. The right of voice required that a representative of the condemned species appear before the full conclave and speak. And the fleet could not fire until that process was complete. But Fleet Commander Halox had already filed a formal objection, arguing that the law's timeline provisions meant the speaker had to appear within one galactic cycle or the right would expire. That gave them roughly 12 hours. Chorus-Tal, her ship barely functional and her crystalline body still cracked from the heat of her broadcast, worked with Arbiter Yelan through a secure channel to solve an impossible problem. They needed to make first contact with a species that did not know the galaxy existed, explain that it had been sentenced to death, and find a single human willing to speak on behalf of 8 billion people, all before the clock ran out. Yelan asked the obvious question. How do you choose one voice to represent an entire world? Already knew the answer. She had spent weeks studying Earth's signals, and one name kept appearing in the data. A scientist in Accra, who had published a paper theorizing that the energy pattern at the edge of the solar system was artificial. A woman who had looked at the impossible and had the courage to say what she saw. Dr. Amara Osei. They brought her aboard Chorus's damaged vessel using a short-range transport beam that Chorus was not technically authorized to use. And Amara materialized in the cabin of an alien ship, with her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Chorus stood before her, a being made of living crystal, 7 feet tall, cracked and burned, glowing faintly blue, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Chorus said, through her translator, I am sorry for the way this has happened. We do not have much time. And she told Amara everything. She told her about the conclave, about the vote, about the fleet, about the extinction order. She told her about the signal, about the music and the stories and the lullabies. She told her about the right of voice and what it meant, that Amara had one chance, one single chance, to stand before 4,000 civilizations and convince them that humanity deserved to live. Amara listened, and her hands shook, and her eyes filled with tears that she wiped away quickly, because she was a scientist, and she was used to dealing with data she did not like. Why me? She asked. Because you saw us coming, Chorus said. Everyone else looked at the sky and saw nothing. That is what the conclave needs to hear. Someone who sees clearly and speaks honestly. Amara wanted to argue, wanted to say that there were better choices, leaders and diplomats and poets who could do this better than a physicist from Accra. But there was no time for that, and she knew it. And so she closed her eyes and took a breath and said, "Take me there." The emergency transport to the conclave station took 2 hours. And during those 2 hours, Chorus offered to help Amara prepare, to coach her on conclave protocol, to suggest arguments that might be effective with specific delegations. Amara refused all of it. If they want to know what a human is, she said, then they should meet one, not a performance. She arrived at the Hall of Extinction, wearing the same clothes she had been wearing in her office in Accra. A simple blouse, dark trousers, flat shoes. She carried no notes. The hall was vast beyond anything she could have imagined, stretching in every direction, filled with beings so alien that her mind could not process them all at once. Crystalline figures, and massive reptilian warriors, and clouds of luminous gas, and insectoid swarms that moved as one, and creatures made of sound, and beings that existed in dimensions she could not perceive. 4,000 civilizations, trillions of lives, watching through the broadcast network. And at the center of it all, a small raised platform where she was expected to stand. Amara walked to the platform. Her footsteps echoed in the silence. She could feel every eye and sensor and awareness in the room focused on her, and she was more afraid than she had ever been in her life. She stood there and looked out at the assembly and did not speak for a long time. When she finally opened her mouth, her voice was quiet, and it shook, but it carried. "You have seen what we are," she said. "I am not here to tell you that you are wrong about us. You are not wrong." A ripple passed through the assembly, surprise, perhaps, that she had not begun with a plea or a defense. "We are everything you fear. We are violent and irrational and self-destructive. We have hurt each other in ways that I cannot stand here and defend. We have built weapons that could end our own world, and we have used them. We have poisoned our own air and water and soil. We have divided ourselves by the color of our skin and the names of our gods, and killed each other over those divisions. You have seen all of this, and it is true, and I will not insult you by pretending it is not." She paused, and the hall was so silent that she could hear her own heartbeat. "But you have also seen what we reach for." Her voice grew steadier. "Every war we have fought, someone on the losing side wrote a poem. Every tyrant we have suffered, someone told a joke in the dark. Every time we have fallen, someone has reached down to pull a stranger back up. Not because it was logical, not because it made sense, but because it felt like the right thing to do. We build hospitals next to our battlefields. We write love letters in the middle of wars. We carry our wounded out of the fire, even when the fire is one we started. We teach our children about our worst mistakes because we want them to be better than we were. I know that is not enough. I know a song does not erase a genocide, and a poem does not undo a war. I am not asking you to forgive us, because we have not earned forgiveness. I am asking you to wait. The word hung in the air. Watch us, test us, judge us by what we do next, not only by what we have done. Let us prove that the signal is not the exception, it is the point. The music, the stories, the apologies, the laughter, that is not noise, that is who we are trying to become. And if we fail, if we become the monsters you fear, then you will not need a fleet. We will have already destroyed ourselves. We almost have before. More than once, we have stood at the edge and looked into the darkness, and come very close to jumping. But we did not jump. And the reason we did not is the same reason I am standing here right now. Because even when the math says there is no hope, even when every rational calculation says it is over, humans do the irrational thing. She looked out at the assembly. at 4,000 civilizations that held her species' life in their hands. And her eyes were wet, but her voice was clear. We hope anyway. Silence filled the Hall of Extinction. A silence so deep and so complete that it seemed to have weight. And then, from the Drenith delegation, a sound began. A single harmonic tone, low and resonant, building slowly, layering on itself the way the Drenith language always did. But this was not a word from their normal vocabulary. This was something new. Something that the translators struggled to render. Cycling through approximations before settling on the closest phrase they could find. Worthy of hearing. Other delegations began to respond. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. The Olharai clicked in a pattern that meant the paradox stands, and several smaller delegations added their voices in their own ways, and the sound built until the hall hummed with it. Arbiter Yalon called the vote. The results came slowly this time, each civilization casting its decision with a weight that the original vote had not carried. 2,600 civilizations voted to stay the extinction. It was not a majority. It was not even close to unanimous, but under the Conclave's charter, it was enough to invoke a probationary period, a provision that had never been used before, a formal declaration that the species would be granted time to prove itself under observation. The extinction order was suspended. The fleet was recalled. In the Hall of Extinction, Amara Osei stood on the platform and felt her knees give way, and she sat down on the cold metal floor and put her face in her hands and wept, not because she was sad, not because she was happy, but because the weight of what had just happened was more than any single person should ever have to carry, and she had carried it, and it was over. Chorus found her there and helped her to her feet, and together they walked out of the hall into the long corridor that led back to the docking bay, where Chorus's battered ship waited to take Amara home. They walked in silence for a long time. Then Amara asked the question that had been sitting in her chest since the moment she had first seen Chorus. Why did you do it? You broke your laws. You destroyed your career. You nearly killed yourself broadcasting our signal. Why? Chorus walked beside her, her cracked crystalline body catching the light of the corridor, and she was quiet for so long that Amara thought she might not answer. Then she spoke. I heard your lullabies, Chorus said. My species has no children. We emerge fully formed from the mineral beds of our home world. We have no concept of holding something small and fragile and singing to it in the dark. She paused. When I heard that sound, a mother's voice, soft and low, meant only for the tiny life in her arms, I felt something I did not have a name for. I wanted to keep that sound safe. I wanted to make sure nothing silenced it. I did not understand why she looked at Amara. I think you call it love. Amara reached out and took Chorus's hand, cool crystal against warm skin, and held it. And they stood there for a moment, two beings from two worlds, connected by a word that one of them had only just learned. Chorus flew Amara home. Earth was still there. The sky was the same. The sun still rose in the east. The ocean still moved against the shore. But everything was different now. Humanity knew it was not alone, and it knew that its survival had not been won by weapons or power or technology. It had been won by a lullaby, a poem, and the stubborn, irrational, deeply human act of reaching out to the darkness and saying the simplest, bravest thing any species had ever said. Hello, we are here, and we hope you are listening.